Hi, my name is Gina Gonzalez. I'm a student of Roman and a chess fanatic. Grandmaster Roman Dzindzichashvili, a Russian and a US champion, is continuing his widely successful Mastering Chess DVD series. This private lesson will further enhance your positional skills. Your better understanding of pawn structure and maneuvering will result in more wins and a higher rating. So sit back and enjoy your private lesson.
Regardless of your style in chess, whether you like open tactical positions or closed positions, even if you are a tactician and you really like open positions, it's not going to always work that way. Sometimes you're going to end up in positions that with a lot of pawns on a board and very strategical. So if you don't have skills playing relatively closed positions with maneuvering, you're not going to go far as a chess player. So what I would like to discuss now is essentials of positional maneuvering, planning, and when you cannot calculate and evaluate position based on I play this move, he plays this move. You have a plan, and there are certain rules that apply when to determine who has a better position. And when you have a plan, certain plan, you follow this plan, and you have to maneuver this knight from this square to that square and maneuver your king. And planning on maneuvering and art of it is inseparable part of a chess game. Without mastering in it, you cannot do much, really. When we talk about positional maneuvering, we are not talking about understanding position, what positions are good and what positions are bad for us, or like evaluating when we have a good bishop versus bad bishop of the opponent and what pawn structure is good. No. When we talk about maneuvering, of course, understanding of the position has to come first, but then you have to know how to play certain position, how to play, what plan to build, and how to maneuver pieces to make a progress in them. This is absolutely essential and very important. Without it, your chess game is not on a good level. So when we talk about positional game and positional maneuvering, we cannot bypass I would say, the father of the positional maneuvering, and like a guru of a positional chess play, Tigran Petrosyan, former world champion, now deceased. Let's look at some of his games and let's see how simply, how perfectly he executed maneuvering part, having small positional advantage. Of course, when he was executing it, it was like his invention and his art on his part. Now, every strong super grandmaster, they all can perform the same way because it's already developed that much and that they can do it by learning it. Well, you learn, it's difficult to invent, it's a lot easier to follow, and they all master in it. So for you, it's necessity, absolute necessity, to know it and to be able to make a progress in strategical closed position and master in maneuvering. Let's look one of the Petrosyan's games against very famous Yugoslavian grandmasters, Ivkov, c4, g6, e4, bishop g7, d4. Through some interesting move order, we got regular King's Indian defense, knight c3, knight c6, bishop e3, e5, d5. Well, I want to mention that there is such a move as knight d4, But this is like a positional discussion, and the opening discussion. I mean, and we are not gonna go through this. We just want to go ahead and see the part we are interested in maneuvering. Knight e7, c5, f5, c takes d, c takes d, and now we're gonna see why white played c5 in early stage of the game, because they want to give this check. And when black played bishop d7, then bishop takes d7, queen takes d7, and f3. Now, white already achieved, now this is the first stage on a getting position. Once you get big positional advantage and play it, it's stage one. But different stages to get there. You see how to get. White put the pawns on light squares, and they exchange their light square bishop, leaving back black a bad dark square bishop. f3 and knight f6 by black. Well, I would seriously consider bishop h6, because as you can see in the game, black had serious problem with dark square bishop, and that's how they lost the game. Knight f6, knight h3, h6, of course stopping knight g5 followed by knight e6, h6, knight to f2. Now black castles. White plays queen a4, queen takes a4, knight takes a4, rook a to c8, and obviously you cannot play bishop takes a7, since after rook a8 white loses a piece. So white goes knight c3, black goes a6. Now in this position, white has better pieces. Bishop on e3 is better than bishop on g7. Black's knights have no future on e7 and f6. Black is in a way smothered. They don't have enough space, and white has to take advantage of their space and slowly squeeze black's position. We see how it's done. King e2, king h7, rook a to c1, and knight to d7. Now after white played knight b1, rook takes c1, rook takes c1, and here black played rook c8. White plays knight a3, rook takes c1, and bishop takes c1. So we got very simple position where white has little more space. Black has bad bishop, and since black does not have much space, their knights are not that good, and they are congested. So after knight to a3, rook takes c1, bishop takes c1. Now white wants to play knight to c4, and black played h5, trying to play bishop h6, maybe exchange dark square bishops. Knight to c4, knight to c8, and here comes the understanding, deep understanding of position. Well, regardless, you don't have to be world champion or anyone on grandmaster level, on Petrosian's level, to understand that exchange of the bishops in this position clearly favors black. They have real problem with their dark square bishop. So if you understand that, so you should understand for white, you should do anything in your power to stop it. So that's why Petrosian played bishop to d2. And black did not play bishop h6, because if they do, white is going to go bishop b4, forcing bishop f8 anyway. So the bad bishop will remain bad for the rest of the game. And obviously knight c5 in this position cannot be played, because after knight takes d6, and due to knight's position on c5 for black, white easily wins the pawn. So after bishop to d2, black played bishop f6. Now white plays a5. This is the real art and very powerful move, and you should be able to understand this move, and you should be able to make moves like this. That's not very hard, but that's very, very important. You almost cannot underestimate you cannot overestimate the power of this move. Knight a5 forces black to push b6, and knight goes to c6. Now, knight standing on c6 does not really threaten anything, but covers a lot of very important squares. Cuts off the bishop's possibility of bishop bringing to d8 and c7, or maybe d8 and b6 with the knight on c4. So we played knight a5 and knight c6. Completely shuts off black's bishop. King g7, bishop to e3. Now white slowly improves position of their dark square bishop. Bishop e3, king f7. Now in the other knight comes into play. Knight d3, king e8, a4, bishop d8, and another very strong maneuver. Black has dark square bishop. White plays knight b4, forcing another pawn go on a dark square. So that makes bishop even worse. And what is more important, after knight to b4, a5, and knight to a2, you see the diagonal is opened. Diagonal from a6 to d3, from a6 to d3, and white's king may be going to the weak square and penetrate, since this is an endgame position. Why knight went to a2? Because potential knight c3 and knight b5. That's how you just pinpoint the weak squares. So those are weak squares, those are penetration squares. Now you see the power of knight on c6. Knight on c6 will never allow black's king to come to defend their queen side. At the same time, if you want to bring the king to c4 and b5, black will not be able to play knight a7 and stop you. That's why knight on c6 is very powerful. And after knight a2, black is totally lost. After f4, bishop f2, g5, king d3, knight to f8, pawn h3. It's just white does not have to rush. They want to stop possible g4 move. Knight g6, knight to c3, bishop to f6, king to c4, king d7, king to b5. There goes. Now b6 pawn is going to fall. King to c7, king to a6. Now you see that it's just a matter of time when all black structure is going to fall apart. g4, hg. Black has to do something. White just simply threatening check and bring king to b7, and eventually they're going to win whole black's queen side. Black played g4. This is another desperation attempt. hg, hg, fg, and after bishop to h4 and knight to d1, bishop takes f2, knight takes f2. Now finally black succeeded exchanging bad bishop for a good bishop, but it's way too late. White simply gonna clean up the queen side. What happened here in the game? Knight c to e7, knight takes e7, knight takes e7, g5, knight g6. Now white has an extra pawn, black's knight has to be completely and totally dedicated to stopping the g-pawn, and white just goes knight g4, and after knight h4, king to a7, and after knight h6, knight h2. That's an interesting maneuver, because all black can play is knight h4 or knight f8. Now knight to f3, and after knight g6, white simply plays b3, forcing black's knight to move, and then knight h4, following by g6, blacks simply resign. They can still go knight h7, g6, knight f6, g7, and they are totally hopeless because knight is going to come to f6 and f5 and h6. Even if black's knight stand here, white can make knight h6 by simply making waiting move, and black has to move knight, and this is an easy win. Now, this at that time, this game was played almost like 25 years ago. At that time, art of positional maneuvering was not that well developed. Now, majority of the good players, almost all good players, they can do the same thing. You should learn it. Now, this is necessity. You don't have to be on the highest level. This is something you learn. It's essentials. It's alphabet of positional understanding and maneuvering. You learn it, you do it. Nothing that happens in this game with today's development in the art of chess is difficult to perform. So you definitely can do it yourself. There is another very good example, I would say, positional masterpiece of maneuvering, also by Petrosian against famous international master Werner Hug from Switzerland. Knight f3, e6, g3, f5, and I keep reminding in every example that we don't want to concentrate. We want to go through to the quickly through the opening part of this game. Knight f6 castled, bishop e7, b3, castle by black, bishop b2, very slow development, bishop b2, a5, a3, queen e8, black prepares some, tries to generate play on the king side, c4, d6, d4, and queen to h5. Knight to c3, knight to d7, e3, c6, knight to e2, preparing to go to f4, g5, and b4. Well, it's obvious that white wants to create some threats and play, maybe develop the attack on the king side, and black tries to do that, and white tries to generate counterplay on the queen side. And after b4, in this position, black plays a takes b, which I think is a mistake because they are underdog on the queen side and they should never have opened file on that side of the board. Bishop takes a1, d5, and c5. Now we see pawn structure became very static, and we see the horrible bishop on c8, badly placed knight on d7, and a weak square on e5. Now, e5 square is, for now, it's covered by knight on d7, but that knight on d7, on the other hand, blocks the bishop on c8. White's bishop on a1 is not that great either, but black has more problems since white has potential play on the queen side, and it's not very clear how can black get any play on a king side. Pushing g4 will weaken f4 square. White can go knight e5 followed by knight f4. So in this position, after c5, knight g4 was played, black provoked h3 and went knight h6. Now they want to play g4 and somehow open the position on king's side. After knight to h6, white played bishop to c3, knight to f7. Well, it's obvious what black wants to do. Black wants to play knight to f6 and knight to e4 and cover the e5 square with the other knight on f7. And after knight f7, white played b5. That's white's play on a queen side. Bishop to f6, queen to a1, and now you can see white wants to penetrate with a queen to a8 and also create weak pawn for black on c6. After queen a1, c takes b, rook to b1, knight d8, rook takes b5, and knight c6. Now black's pieces came to life for a while. Black's pieces, knights are comfortably controlling center, but black has this weak pawn on b7, which clearly determines white's advantage, and still unclear where is black's attack on a king's side. How can it be started? So queen to b2, queen to f7, and knight to e1, bishop to d8, rook to b3, bishop to c7. Okay, black tries to play f4, knight to d3, and after queen g7, queen to a2. White has a plan, maybe playing queen a8, and after queen to a2, knight to f6. Black is still having problems to get something realistic going. If they play f4, white may simply take, and after g takes f, knight takes f4. It's not clear what black gave pawn for. Actually, knight d takes f4 maybe. Even better, protecting the d4 square. So black does not have any breakthroughs. So after knight d3, queen g7, and queen a2, they did play knight f6, and white went bishop a1, and now knight h5. Black is becoming desperate. They want to make f4 move. Bishop f3, again interfering with black's plan, f4. Knight f6, bishop g2. They repeated position once, and now white played bishop d2, controlling the f4 move. f4 cannot be played now. King h8, queen to b1, and now bishop went to b8. Black does not have too many useful moves. Rook a3, bishop c7, and rook a8, and after h6, queen to d1. That's very strong move because keeps an eye on h5 knight. White wants to play knight c3 and knight b5, and knight c3 will be with the tempo attacking the h5 knight. Queen to d1, black played queen g6, and now bishop to c1. Queen h7. Now what is significant here, what is very, very important to know, what is all this maneuvering, what does it do for white? Okay, first, white has to combine two things. They have to slowly try to break through on a queen side. At the same time, they have to be very careful to control black's breakthrough and black's attack on the king side. So far they've been very successful doing it, and after queen h7, knight to c3, and when black played knight f6, then knight to b5, now knight comes into the game. and after queen to g7, knight to d6, and now you can tell if black gives up the bishop, dark square bishop, then after cd they are in a lot of trouble, because now dark square bishop is gone and c5 and e5 squares are accessible. There is no queen d7. Black has no chance to win e pawn because white can play either bishop a3 or knight e5, and on queen takes d6, knight g6 check. So it's real bad for black to give up a dark square bishop, and when they played queen d7, then when white went knight to e5, and after knight takes e5, it's day takes e, and now it's clear black can never take on d6. Black has a very, very difficult choice to make. Taking on d6 is absolutely deadly, because white, besides having dominating pawn structure and protected pass pawn on d6, they also have extremely powerful dark square bishop. Well, on the other hand, if black doesn't do that, they can't tolerate the knight on d6 too long. This is total triumph or the strategy of maneuvering. You see, white was holding black's breakthrough f4 for many moves, and then finally, slowly, it took him about 35 moves to mount the knight on d6, and now black's game is over. After knight e4, bishop to a3, bishop takes d6, e takes d. Finally, this diagonal opened, a1, h8 diagonal, and after the knight e5, e takes d, black played rook g8 and resigned at the same time. White has very comfortable choices here. They can play queen d4 check, bishop f1, and come out with a bishop. After queen d4, if black plays king h7, bishop b2, and every black's piece is almost stalemated. They can't move at all. This is total positional nightmare and a beautiful way of maneuvering. Remember, about 25 moves ago, there was nothing concrete for white. There was never, ever anything concrete for white. But they maneuvered the way. They know the key was the weakness on e5 and the play open files on the queen side. So what has happened? Knight from d3, e1, d3, e2, actually c3, b5, and d6 got on d6, and then the other knight of white's got to e5, and that's how black's position completely deteriorated. So that's a beautiful example of maneuvering in completely closed position. Those first two examples that we looked were based strictly on the space advantage for white, and that's how they slowly squeezed their opponent, squeezed the life out of them. Now, next example, white never had superiority in a space. You're going to see beautiful maneuvering on weak light squares. That's actually a classical game, and now you see a lot of masters and grandmasters using the same technique. They have same understanding now, but game was played almost like 35 years ago, and this is like a classic of the good positional assessment and good maneuvering. Also by Petrosian, knight f3, d5, g3, g6, bishop g2, bishop g7. We're going to go quickly through the opening. e5, d3, knight e7, knight b to d2, black castled. white went e4, and after c6, rook e1. Now you see the e5 pawn is hanging because white is threatening e takes d, followed by knight takes e5. So black played d4, and after a4, a5. And in this position, white played bishop to f1. Now, why bishop f1? What does bishop f1 do? White tries to open generate some play on the queen side, and d3 pawn has to be protected. They couldn't play c3 right away because after d takes c and b takes c, queen takes d3 will win a pawn for black. So bishop f1. So I think we should start paying attention once we got the position where we have a good chances for positional squeeze. So bishop f1, c5. This move I really think is a big mistake. The reason why this is a mistake because weakens c4 and b5 square. So c4 square becomes permanent outpost for white, and with a pawn on c6, black had a chance to cover c4 square. Now, black played c5, white played c3, knight e2 c6, knight c4, and knight a6. Now h4, h6, h5. This is very interesting maneuver. This is typical positional pattern. This one. White does not play h4 and h5 to take on g6 and to mate black on h-file because there's going to be a while before any piece comes to h-file. That's not it. So white just wants to take on g6 to get good pawn structure and to eliminate black's f-pawn and later on maybe going f4. So black's reaction is natural, may not necessarily be correct one, but h5, g5. Now white plays bishop e2. Now this move is understandable because they don't want to lose a pawn after bishop g4. Now after bishop e2, bishop g4 will be met by knight h2. Now what did white accomplish playing h5? White accomplished that made weak light squares which they can possibly occupy, and you're going to see in a very near future this will be done. That will totally kill black's dark square bishop. So after bishop to e2 and bishop e6, knight f3 goes to d2. That's a good move because we want to protect knight with the knight to maintain the outpost on c4. Knight to f to d2, knight c7. You see, white wants to play bishop g4, and there is no way black can stop it. Bishop g4 is a next move. f5 will be big mistake because e takes f, bishop takes f5, and knight e4. Now white has totally dominating knights in the center, and stopping bishop g4 by playing queen d7 or queen c8 is not possible because of knight b6 fork. So black cannot stop white from playing bishop g4. They went knight c7, bishop g4, and bishop g4 is a pawn sacrifice. Now what happened after bishop g4? Black played d takes c, b takes c, and queen takes d3. Now we're going to see real positional assessment of this position, such as this. Bishop takes e6, knight takes e6. It doesn't look like white is more active than black. Besides, black has an extra pawn. But black's position is really bad here. White played rook e3 just to protect the c3 pawn, queen d8, and now white played rook b1, and after rook b8, queen e2. Now let's assess this position. c4 square is the permanent square for white's knight. White will go on knight b6 and knight c4. And now compare those knights that totally centralized to black's knights. Both knights together, they don't have one active square. They don't have any future in this position. So knight standing in a active position in the center, it does not mean much unless there is a future for this knight. There is absolutely no future. c3 and g3 pawns, they cover all entry points from this knight. Meanwhile, white has dominating knight on c4. Queen e2, knight to e7, knight b6, queen c7, and knight d to c4, rook fd8. See, the black had no way to protect the a pawn. Now white takes the a pawn, and after knight c8 goes knight a to c4. Now they got their pawn back, and black has all the light squares extremely weak. Knight takes b6, knight takes b6. This position is a total disaster for black, and it's absolutely lost because white has this open b file, centralized knight. They can put on c4 or d5, and very weak f5 square potentially. Black has bad bishop on g7, knight on e6 that placed okay but has absolutely no places to go and no functions to perform. So that's why this position is absolutely lost for black. Queen c6, a5, knight c7. Black is trying to do something with this knight. At least they covered the d5 square. So bishop a3, bishop f8, just waiting move king g2, bishop e7, knight to c4 by white, f6, rook to b6. You see how white's pieces completely smothering black's position. Rook to b6, queen to a4, queen to a2. That's because it's not because white has done something bad and black played bad. Black played bad getting to the position with so many weaknesses. And after that, whatever white did was more than enough to win. After queen a2, king g7, rook to f3, you see the clear threat, knight takes e5 and queen f7 check. So black played rook d7, and after knight takes e5, they resign, because if black takes, that's total disaster. After queen f7 check, king h8, rook takes h6, checkmate. This is a beautiful example of taking advantage of weak light squares and maneuvers that white did. And the pawn sacrifice was very temporary because white sacrificed pawn that black had never had a chance to consolidate their positions, and a total triumph for white's strategy. Next game we're going to see is between, at that time, top two grandmasters in the world, Enrique Making and also Petrosian. They say another game by Petrosian. d4, knight f6, another very quiet, and remember all the openings he played were very quiet. Petrosian is white. Knight f3, e6, bishop g5, c5, e3, d5, and c3. Very quietly played opening by white. Knight bd2, c takes d, e takes d, bishop to e7, bishop d3, h6, bishop to e. Well, here white could go bishop h4, but then they lose control after g5 and bishop g3, knight h5. They may lose control on dark squares because black is going to eliminate dark square bishop of white. So on h6, bishop f4 was played. Now black went knight h5 and bishop e3. Now, and knight f6, and now white played knight e5. Now white played knight e5. They want to play f4 and support this knight on e5, and it's going to be very, very difficult for black to do something with this knight on e5. For example, if they take the knight on e5, that will give him very, very bad pawn structure. White is going to have great pawn structure, having this pawn chain and open f-file. But kicking this knight with a pawn is going to be also very difficult. On something like knight d7 and f6, g6 becomes very weak square. So before white played f4, black took on e5, forcing white to retake with a d pawn. And now after knight takes e5, de, and knight d7, we see the weak square on d4. Bishop d4 by white, knight to c5, bishop to c2, a5, queen to g4. Now black has to be very careful. Obviously they cannot even consider castling kingside, because white is going to have very strong attack going somehow h4, maybe rook h3 and rook g3. Also knight is coming to f3. So black simply played g6. Then white castled, bishop d7, rook f to e1, queen c7, a4, and after knight a6, queen to e2. Now let's talk about this position. Black's problems in this position, black's problems are the bishop on d7, that's a weak bishop, has very little to none future. King side, it's very dangerous to castle here because king side is weakened. So white has clear advantage, so black played king f8, and now white plays knight f3, and after king g7, they go bishop to e3. And you see, this is a very interesting move. What white is doing, bishop on d4 is not the best piece to be, it's not the best outpost for, bishop is not the best piece to take the outpost on d4. So after bishop e3, knight c5, white put the knight on d4. This outpost is for knight. Obviously, queen takes e5 cannot be played because after bishop takes h6, black loses their queen. So, and then white managed to put the knight on d4, and after rook a6, go to bishop to c1, rook a to a8, back, g3, b6, h4. Now white wants to shake in position, black's position after h5, and on g5, maybe f4. So black went h5, and I think this is a weak move since it's weakened black's position even more. I'm talking about the dark squares, g5 and f6. Queen to f3, queen to d8, bishop to d2, and queen to e8. Black attacks white's pawn on a4. Bishop to g5 was played, and after bishop g5, black cannot really take the pawn and take on a4, because what will happen after bishop takes a4, white can go b4, and this is going to be real bad for black now because of bishop takes c2, b takes c, and bishop hangs, and when bishop retreats to a4, white can go queen f6 check and c takes b. Position is absolutely hopeless. Not to mention that black had to go to g8 because on king a4 there is a possibility of rook takes a4 and mating next move on f7. So black, that means that black cannot think about winning the a4 pawn. But white's plan is to exchange the dark square bishops and then all the dark squares on king's side will be extremely weak for black. So after bishop g5, queen to d8, and now white goes queen f4, rook c8, and rook to e3. King is on g7, rook to e3, preparing rook to f3, bringing more pieces. Bishop takes g5, h takes g, rook to a8. All black can do just sit and wait what is going to happen to them. Queen f6, that's a beautiful positional squeezing move. Queen takes f6, e takes f, king h7, king g2, rook a, e8, and f4. Now you see that white has semi-open e-file. They have a beautiful square on d4 for knight. Now they got another square if they want in the future to another outpost to use is on e5 for knight. But for now, f4, rook to b8, rook e to e1. Now it goes maneuvering. Notice that the plan, that's what it counts when it's maneuvering. Sometimes you can go back and forth without changing position significantly. Position remains the same. White could have played for maybe 20 moves, going with the king back and forth with rooks, but the plan, that's what counts. Knight b7, rook h1. Now they want to go g4, king g8, knight f3. There it is. Knight is going to e5, knight d6, knight to e5, and on bishop e8, bishop to d3. Now rook to c8, king to f3, bishop c6, rook to h2. White is making improvement every move. After rook h2, if black plays d4, they just lose a pawn. After knight takes c6, rook takes c6, and c takes d without any compensation. So they decided not to play d4 check, and they played bishop e8 back, just waiting, king to e3, rook to c7, and king to d4. That shows how the superiority of white's pieces. You see, black can come. This is not necessarily endgame position, and this is type of middle game position. When queens are off the board, this does not always mean that we are in the endgame. When king went to d4, that shows how bad black's pieces are. They can never attack the king, and king safely came in the center, protecting some vital squares, protecting c3 pawn, and maybe white wants to push d4. After king d4, knight b7, b4, another very strong move, stopping black from playing knight to c5. In this position, after knight b7, b4, knight to d8, black wants to play knight c6, somehow exchange some of white's pieces that won't let them breathe freely. So after knight to d8, rook to h4, what white wants to do, they want to play rook h1 and g4. They don't want black to play h4 and just win a pawn. They are going for whole thing on the king's side, for a mating attack. So rook to h4 is a very strong move. And after rook to h4, black played knight b7 again. Rook to a2. This position can be won several different ways. White just chooses one. And Petrosian, with his style, he was never rushing to win winning position quickly. He wanted to make sure there is no counterplay was given to his opponent. After knight d6, rook to h1. Well, b5 would have been very good. Well, rook h1, knight b7, and now white went b5, and after knight c5, bishop to c2, knight d7, rook to a3, and knight c5, and now finally white played c4. Well, what is white doing here? And after dc, knight takes c4. Sometimes it's good when you have big positional advantage, and practically white is playing with an extra rook, because rook on h8 is absolutely out of the game. So after c4, knight to d7, rook to c3. You see, they want to open position and get in and play the middle game position or with the extra rook on the board. So rook c3, knight takes e5. Now king takes e5. This is total domination of white with white king. The king takes e5 and d takes c. And now bishop to e4, rook c8. White can wait with taking the c4 pawn. They went after rook to c8, king to d6. And now you see we reached position where black has no moves. On king h7, by the way, there will be rook takes h5, very decisive shot. So after king d6, rook to c5, rook h to c1, black went h4 and resigned at the same time. Now white can simply play rook takes c4, rook takes c4, rook takes c4, and after hg, simply rook c8, because g3 pawn is not really going anywhere. And on king h7, simply king e7, trapping the bishop on e8 and simply ending the game. Another beautiful masterpiece, and squeezing with a beautiful maneuvering, squeezing the life out of bad pieces by black. So this is very well played game by white, and another masterpiece of positional maneuvering.